Hi, this is Stan Dubin, and welcome to the Hiring Tips Podcast. The name of this tip is Should You Hire a Recruiter? Part 2. In Part 1, we had Kathleen Steffey, and we're fortunate to have her again in Part 2. And something I probably should have asked her in the beginning of Part 1, but we'll do it now, is Kathleen, tell us about your background as a recruiter.
Thanks for having me again. So I have 25 years of recruiting experience, and I started out in recruiting at an agency only for 6 months. And then one of my clients picked me up and offered me a corporate recruiting position. And I was in corporate recruiting for many years and worked my way up to corporate recruiting leadership. And then I started Naviga. And I've owned Naviga for 18 years, and we are a sales and marketing recruiting firm. We do national search and mostly for large businesses, but also businesses that are around 5 and 10 million in revenue.
Okay, now when you say sales and marketing, you mean searching and finding excellent sales people and marketing people?
Yes. Yep. Corporate sales and corporate marketing people.
Okay, good. All right. So excellent. Now there's two really very different ways of going about hiring a recruiting firm, or in terms of the two different types of recruiting firms, one being called a contingency recruiting firm, the other one retained recruiting firm. Can you go over the differences?
Absolutely. It's interesting because I started out as a contingency recruiting firm. So when you listen to the differences, it'll be interesting to see that contrast and how I even migrated. So a contingency recruiting firm, employers don't have to pay anything up front to engage their services. So they only pay once the person is hired. So it's pretty clean that way and easy. There's essentially no investment for the employer other than throwing a job description to them and saying, see what you can do. They are generally a one-man or two-man shop, if you will. They don't have a lot of infrastructure, and they do splits. And what that means is they kind of network the position out to other recruiters who are independent contractors and see if they can help fill it too. And those people need to make money, and it's just kind of like a webby situation. And there's not a deep process and not a lot of accountability from the employer to that contingency firm, or if they try, they don't have a lot of success because there's just no investment up front. And then the prioritization of the jobs on the recruiter's end, they just don't prioritize the employer's position because it's contingency, and it's kind of like whoever search can come in and is the easiest. That's what is ahead of the game for them in terms of prioritization. Any questions about contingency?
No, that was good. That was good.
Okay. All right. And retain, this is what Naviga does now. Well, this is the type of firm we are. And there's a small investment up front to hold accountability to the recruiting firm. It can range anywhere from like $2,000 to $10,000, depending on the type of search, if it's executive level or individual contributor. Some firms invoice another installment, once the firm submits 4 candidates, for an example, the employer gives another installment of, anywhere from 2 to 10K. And there's just a tremendous amount of infrastructure with retained firms, where they have people inside the business that are specialized in doing different parts of recruiting. Like they have sourcers that actually do research. They've got recruiters who call and solicit. They have project managers who manage the whole project that they're doing and facilitate the success of the project. So there's a lot of moving parts with a retained search firm, and it has to do with the accountability that the employer is holding because there's an upfront investment. They also usually have more tools and can go deep with those tools, and the expertise goes deep. And in general, you have greater success with them. So,
right. So a clear distinction is contingencies. A contingency recruiting firm is going to find somebody or a couple of somebodies for a company, but they will not get paid until they decide to hire one of those individuals, but they don't have to hire anyone. With a retained one, because there's more work being done and there's a lot more happening, there is a bit of an investment up front. And with the retained, if a retained recruiting firm comes up with 4 candidates, does the client have to choose one of those?
No, they don't have to. I mean, sometimes you have to do a second round where they'll evaluate 8 people versus 4. And even at 8, they don't have to do anything. However, if they don't pull the trigger, they lose the retainer in that investment. So they are inclined to really have that retained search firm dedicated and exclusive to be, the person that's working on the position.
Right. Okay. And one of the things we mentioned, I think, in the first show, and one of the things I'm finding with a number of my clients, especially if they're not in a major urban area, is a very skilled position comes open, and there isn't a lot of choice out there for the client, and they're pulling their hair out trying to find somebody to fill this position. Now, but they're also not like a very large company with $5 to $10 million in revenue. This is just off the cuff here, Kathleen. If somebody wanted some help finding someone like that, would you do that? Would you be able to do that? And would that cost vary? I mean, they're basically trying to locate somebody who meets that skill set. They're having difficulty doing it, but they're not looking to spend tens of thousands of dollars, so to speak.
Yeah. The cost wouldn't vary because then it would just be too subjective about quoting, based on what somebody thinks is tough to fill versus us. And most of the time, I'd say 99% of the time, if we are given a search, we're filling it. And it really has to do with the tools, the experience, the resources on the recruiting team to make it happen. And it's just, there's depth to having a search firm, and then, it's shallow if you don't. So you can only go so deep yourself if you don't actually have expertise in doing it, from a tool standpoint and actual people, and then experience, processes, all these different things that impact the search. So a lot of times clients will think that it's a very tough position. And when we do a deep dive, we're like, oh, okay, we got this. And, we fill it within 30 to 45 days, which is pretty much industry standard. So.
All right. Sounds good. Now, I noticed somewhere a few things you had written about just different advice that you give along the hiring line. And one of the things that you recommend to people making hiring decisions, whether it's in the HR department or whether it's an owner or executive making that final decision, your advice is keep changing with the times and keep changing with the tools to reach candidates. The tools in themselves have changed over the years, which of course is happening more and more at light speed. Mm-hmm. And make sure you're adjusting with the times and continuing to innovate. Can you talk some more about these tools that just I think in some cases seem overwhelming to those doing the hiring these days?
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, I started recruiting when computers weren't in part of our process in recruiting. Like we had a book of names and numbers. We didn't have email addresses, and we had a telephone, and that was it. We didn't have email. We didn't have anything like that. So obviously it's evolved over the years where technology is our friend, and it gives us a platform to reach different people, many different people, in a much faster time frame. So employers have to make sure they're set up that way. If they've got a recruiting department or an A player HR person, they need to make sure that they're well equipped to do their job. And so gone are the days where only your applicant tracking system can get you talent. You have to be on different platforms out there like LinkedIn. You have to subscribe to different research tools like Zoom Info to peel back and make sure that you're finding the right data, if you will, to go solicit them. It's interesting because a CRM system or an applicant tracking system that your internal recruiters will use, they're only as good as the data is relevant. And literally a week later, you might know something about a candidate and you input that into the ATS system. But then a week later, that candidate is already interviewing with another company. And then another week later, they're hired on somewhere and their title has changed, their industry has changed, all that stuff. So I find that you really have to be proactive and be on different platforms out there outside of your applicant tracking system in order to stay relevant and do your job, productively as a recruiter.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. And let's see, here's one last question I wanted to ask you. You mentioned something, this is also to the employer, to the individual that's making a hiring decision. If you have concerns about hiring someone, don't do it. It rarely ever works.
My team probably hates this by now because I say if it's gray, stay away. So if somebody is picking up on different behaviors in the recruiting process and their personality is changing a little bit, or their response time is changing a little bit or a lot, you don't want to ignore these behaviors that you're noticing. And you actually need to bring them to the forefront in order to say, all right, are these real behaviors? Is this the real person, or is this just a fluke? And then as time goes on in your process, you need to have your antennas up more than ever in order to evaluate these particular things that you're picking up on. Because you only have, I feel like you only have one chance to make this decision right. And if they're showing wrong behaviors in the process, I'm more inclined to pull them out of the process than give them a chance. Because I swear, every time we end up giving a chance and going against our intuition, most times we mess up, or the hiring manager makes a wrong decision. And, I've seen it too many times over the past 25 years. So a vetting process that I like to put in place with my recruiters is if it's gray, stay away. If you're starting to see indicators, don't go for it. Just don't. We'll be able to recruit somebody else that doesn't show these types of characteristics. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Okay, good. Well, that, I think, kind of wraps it up. It was so nice of you to do. But by the way, Naviga, with a website to reach Kathleen, and there'll be a bunch of links for Kathleen in the show notes, but it's navigarecruiting.com, Naviga recruiting.com. But I wanted to ask you, what's the significance of Naviga?
Oh, gee. Okay, back in the day when the business first started, I was in business with my husband, and we were helping decrease telecom expenditures with corporations. And he actually came up with the name, and he's like, navigate through your telecom costs, Naviga. Okay. So that's how it started. And that's it. We stuck with it. He's been out of the business now for years, and it became a recruiting firm.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Because I know we mentioned it a couple of times during the show, and I'm going, I wonder if the listeners have any clue what Naviga means. Okay. That finishes up the show. Thank you very much, Kathleen, for coming on both shows.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. In addition to our podcast, we have a service that will help you hire honest, trustworthy, and dependable staff. Watch our 3-minute video at thetestingservice.com. Once again, that's thetestingservice.com. recruiting.com.